Hello. My name is Carol Gross. I'm the staff program director here in IEEE Future Directions, and we are about to start our last presentation for this forum. So it is my pleasure to welcome our last speaker, Ian Donoghue from Trinity College Dublin, who is going to present a talk on monitoring for biodiversity to address climate goals. During Ian's presentation, I would remind you to keep your lines muted and to enter your questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation for a few minutes and address your questions then. So thank you so much for being with us. Ian, take it away. Give us a short presentation of your background before starting your talk, just so we understand how your background relates to the work you're presenting today. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you very much, everybody, for this invitation to come speak with you today, and to all of you for being here. My name is Ian Donoghue. I'm Professor in Environmental Science in Trinity College in Dublin, in Ireland. And actually, I'm a bit different. I guess I stick out from a lot of your other speakers because I am not an electronic engineer or even an engineer. I'm actually an ecologist. I've been working as an ecologist for more than 25 years now. Started working in the field, very much in African ecosystems, in aquatic ecosystems, and then my work since then really encompasses aquatic and terrestrial and marine systems. Pretty much I'm a very general ecologist, and what I'm interested in is general ecological principles. So I like to integrate theory with experimental information and observations from the field to really make important general insights, or what I think are important general insights about ecosystems, and particularly in a general sense how they respond to anthropogenic pressure or global environmental change, particularly, I guess, looking at how their stability responds, so how their stability may be eroded by aspects of global environmental change. And that's why I guess I'm speaking to you today. It's because we really are at, I was going to say cliff edge, but actually no, I think we're at a point now where we have an enormous opportunity in front of us in terms of leveraging the power of technology through the development of novel sensors, but also through obviously things like AI and computation, to really develop a step change in our understanding of the natural world and of biodiversity change. And I think that's what I'm going to really focus this talk on today. So thank you very much. As usual, I've spoken too much, but that's just my first slide. So I think you will have heard, and I think a real focus of this conference is something that information that we're surrounded by. It's sort of almost needless to say in many ways, but it doesn't do any harm reiterating the fact that we are, without a shadow of a doubt, hurtling towards what can only be called a climate disaster. We have almost all the vital signs, or key indicators of climate and climate dynamics on the planet, are pointing in a very, very worrying trajectory at the global scale. So these data here, these are just 16 of many important, what we call climate vital signs, really collated from Bill Ripple's most recent 2025 State of the Climate Report. And you can see, again, we really are in, frankly, dire straits, which to the point where climate change is threatening the sustainability of human civilization as we know it. Something that's less strongly reported, but equally, perhaps even more existentially worrying for humanity, is the fact that we're also right in the middle of what can only be called a biodiversity emergency, or something we might call an extinction crisis, a global extinction crisis. At present, the extinction rate of species from our planet is many thousands of times in excess of background rates, that is, rates before humanity appeared on the planet. These here are just some key highlights, or if you want, lowlights, really, the most worrying aspects collated from the most recent, that's 2024 Living Planet report produced by the World Wildlife Foundation, our fund. And you can see in marine systems on the top, terrestrial systems in the middle, freshwater systems on the bottom, all of our measures of populations of wildlife that are monitored by the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, have been trending downwards really quite alarmingly. So to the point where in freshwater systems, you can see there on the bottom, we've seen an 85% reduction in freshwater vertebrate populations since since these data started to be recorded back in 1970. That's remarkable. In 50 years, 85% reduction in animal vertebrate populations in freshwaters, 69% terrestrial systems, 56% in marine systems. It's really remarkable. And actually to just personalize that a bit, I bring students every year on a tropical ecology and conservation course to one of the most important and exciting places on the planet when it comes to biodiversity, which is the Masai Mara Serengeti National Reserve in Kenya and Tanzania. We've been going there for almost 3 decades now. And in that time alone, so in my own lifetime of visiting there with students, there has been a 2/3 decline in animal biomass in what really should be thought of as one of the most protected and certainly one of the most important natural ecosystems on the planet. So really, in our own lifetimes, we're seeing these really worrying, dramatic declines in biodiversity. And I think what's really important for us to understand, and that's why I have tied in biodiversity monitoring with climate change in this presentation, and that's simply because climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably intertwined. So on the top of this slide, you'll see what we call the climate stripes, something that I hope you're all familiar with. And these are the climate stripes that stretch from the year 1970 to 2018. And the colors go from blue to red, highlighting which years have the highest average temperatures. Blue for the coldest in that time span, and red for the warmest. And you can see temperatures are increasing really remarkably so over the last 50 years or thereabouts, since we started recording this properly. But on the bottom, in the green, starting at green on the bottom left, this is the Biodiversity Intactness Index. So that relates and it arises out of the WWF Living Planet report. And what it shows is how biodiversity has changed since this index started. It started to be measured back in 1970. So the greener the index, the more closely related ecosystems are to being intact or to being sort of pristine in terms of their biodiversity relative to unimpacted non-human presence. And as we go then to the more gray, it means they're more and more impacted over time. And you can see really that the inextricably intertwined nature of climate change and biodiversity loss, how we're both going very much on the same very, very negative trajectory in that time. And that's because the main drivers of climate change and biodiversity are the same. It's human activity such as deforestation, land use change, and overharvesting of wild animals and pollution. Some horrible and worrying statistics. I mean, for example, to give you an indication of how much we've changed the planet, livestock make up 62% of the world's mammal biomass. Humans account for 34% of the world's mammal biomass, and wild mammals make up just 4%. Global poultry weighs more than twice that of wild birds. So we have completely reshaped the planet, reshaped its ecosystems, and it's causing a real undermining of what is our life support system, biodiversity. Biodiversity is, of course, all of the animals and plants. It's all life on Earth and all variety and types of life on Earth. So what are the solutions to this? Well, as the world is becoming increasingly impoverished, we are eroding its capacity, its resilience to future disturbances and other elements of global environmental change. So what we need are these joint, what we might call win-win solutions that jointly address simultaneously climate change and biodiversity loss. I mean, for example, one of the most obvious examples is changing our energy production towards entirely renewable sources. We might not think of wind energy, for example, onshore or in the water as something that's really positive for biodiversity. But actually, wind farms, again, be they on land or on water, have enormous footprints, and they have that footprint of land and underwater habitat have enormous potential to enhance biodiversity and protect biodiversity. So the wind energy industry, for example, is not just decarbonizing our economies and enhancing energy security by harnessing the power of wind, but also the land and under the water, the aquatic habitats on which they sit, these wind farms sit, provide an enormous range of what we call ecosystem services to society and to humanity, including protection of wildlife and biodiversity, but other essential services like carbon sequestration to enhance climate change mitigation, providing habitat for organisms. They filter water, they cycle nutrients, and so on. And we need to quantify those and really harness those positive effects of these joint win-win solutions to really address jointly the biodiversity and climate change crises. There are many other ways of doing this. We tend to address them and call them nature-based solutions, which, according to the IUCN, are defined as actions that restore and manage ecosystems and their services to address climate challenges while offering co-benefits for human well-being and biodiversity. So there's many examples of these things, but really it's using nature and harnessing the power of nature to both protect biodiversity, enhance climate change mitigation, and also provide some societal benefits. For example, integrated constructed wetlands that treat wastewater using natural processes, the restoration of peats for water infiltration, water security to enhance carbon sequestration, restoring seagrass meadows for carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling on the seashores, and also to protect coasts from erosion, and also other examples from other ecosystems like mangroves. Mangrove ecosystems are really excellent for providing food through recruitment for juvenile fish and fish populations. They help to regulate the climate, they stabilize shorelines, but also, of course, really importantly, they protect coastal communities around the world from the growing impacts of larger and more frequent storms. And to give an example of if you like, leveraging the power of technologies for climate change and joint climate change and biodiversity mitigation, biodiversity loss mitigation. I'll give you some examples from one of my postdocs who now is working in the University of Oxford in the UK. This is Dr. Yu Mo. What she has done over the last few years working here is she's harnessed the power of long-term satellite data, where basically she has looked at data, and these are in purple here, the purple lines, from every storm that actually took place around the world between the year 2000 and 2021, so over a 20-something year period. She looked at how those storms impacted mangrove ecosystems around the planet. Those mangrove ecosystems there are highlighted in the green dots you see. She looked at when those storms impacted or crossed with mangrove ecosystems, the amount of damage. We actually looked at ecological responses of these mangrove ecosystems over time. And those storm site pairs, there's more than 5,000 or 6,000 of them that we found significant damage to mangroves. Those storm site pairs are highlighted here in orange. So a really large data set, which she then used machine learning tools to produce some predictive models. And our response variables, we actually looked at, so here's time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, it's our measure of mangrove condition and mangrove cover. And what she did was she looked at when storms impacted mangroves, how much they were damaged in the first instance. You'll see that drop in the green line here. There we go. I'll use my pen. You can see this drop here in this green line here. And then what she also measured is when they reacted, how long did that damage actually propagate through those ecosystems and increase over time? And then she also looked at how long it took these mangrove ecosystems to recover over a 5-year period. And what she found was these sort of things, this sort of data and this level of information was never before possible to attain at the global scale, or even very challenging to obtain at the local scale. But using the really large power of the data that she had, she was able to explore which were the main drivers of damage and reactivity, or the propagation of damage in these systems, and also what was the main drivers of recovery in these mangrove ecosystems, to really assist management and our ability to understand and predict and actually protect mangrove ecosystems from storms. I think a key take home here in this case is that the main drivers of damage, this is the damage that occurs immediately after storms, were driven by storm characteristics. But as you go over longer time scales, storm frequency became a key driver of damage propagation and of recovery, and also vegetative characteristics, things like the patch size of mangroves, the total cover of mangroves, and the canopy height, all of a sudden became much more important predictors of these stability responses, these responses to storms. And not only do we have long-term data to understand and predict mangrove ecosystem responses to these storms around the world, but also we can see from her data sets that the amount of storms that are impacting and affecting mangrove ecosystems are growing very strongly and significantly over the last 40 years. So we have about a 13% increase in all damage-causing cyclones impacting mangroves between the 20 years from 1981 to 2000, and then from 2001 to 2020. And this occurs over all kinds of cyclones, from relatively weak ones to strong ones, slow-moving ones, and fast-moving cyclones. In fact, fast-moving cyclones have increased by 25% pretty much over the last 40 years. And using this information, we can then explore how over the last 2 decades, these different stability responses, so the rate of recovery, the amount of damage that occurs in ecosystems, the amount of damage propagation that occurs after a storm passes, how those are changing over time. So these are the linear models of those stability responses, and these are the slopes and how they change over time. So the filled bars are significant changes in stability. And overall, we're seeing over time more storms undermining and eroding the stability of mangrove ecosystems around the world. But how those stability responses are changing are actually different on different continents. And so this really allows us to give us a much more finer scale understanding of how ecosystems are responding to climate change. This is global to regional scale. Of course, we can do things using remote sensing from satellites and drones at much finer scales. This is information here from a wind farm site in Ireland. Just on 2016, this is remote sensing data from before a wind farm was developed. This is afterwards. So we're talking over a few kilometers here is the scale we're looking at. And of course, we have many, many different technologies now and apps and things like that. This one here was developed by a former PhD student, Anthony Gibbons, that allows us to pinpoint any area in the world. And you can use satellite information or drone information, whatever it is you like, and it will quantify how the landscape, so the different habitat types in the area that you're interested have changed over whatever timescales you're interested in. And this can happen, obviously, you can look at it from distinct time points, or you can automate this process as well. So why we have these really powerful technologies for measuring ecological responses to climate change and other human pressures at really large scales, from global scale, regional scale, and even more local scales. We actually do not have any, you'll notice I haven't mentioned yet anything to do with the much smaller local scale or site scale biodiversity measures, or any technologies to measure that. And a real issue is that actually This is a paper here that's only been published this year called The Global Human Impact on Biodiversity. It was published in Nature there only a few months ago. The only thing I really want to draw your attention to is this is a very large meta-analysis done on all ecosystem types around the planet from studies done at all scales. And what they're showing, so on the y-axis here, on the x-axis here, it's the log response ratio of local diversity change in response to pressure. The only thing I want to draw your attention to here is that impacts of human pressures on biodiversity are best detected at the local scale. Local scale responses to biodiversity are by far the most sensitive. And that means if we want to understand biodiversity loss and how to measure and manage it, we need local scale characterization of biodiversity. So forgive me, but I have a few quotes thrown in to this presentation. And here's one of my favorite ones from the very great Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one affects all." Now, of course, Luther King Jr. was talking about social networks and how everybody can make a difference. For me, though, this statement is very much a truism for the biosphere, for the natural world. I'm illustrating that with the very famous example of a butterfly flapping its wings on one part of the planet can cause a cyclone on the other side of the planet. But really what it means, and this is shown true again and again in biological systems, is that we can have these very strong cross-scale effects where small things can have really, really big effects. A nice example of that is really, I think, given here by a great paper by my colleague, Helmut Hillebrand. We wrote this paper quite a few years ago in response to a lot of questions about how ecosystems actually change in response to human disturbance, and are there basically tipping points and thresholds beyond which life and ecosystems collapse? The answer to that was actually no, or these things are very, very unlikely. It's the largest, I think still to date, the largest meta-analysis in ecology. So we put together information and analyzed data from more than 4,600 studies. But really, for the purposes of this presentation, all I really want to show is that the fact that predicting local scale biodiversity responses is actually hugely challenging. And that's because the only thing I want to draw your attention to here is on the x-axis here, we have normalized environmental pressures. So of these 4,600 studies, we put them together and we looked at we analyzed all of the pressures and disturbances that were imposed experimentally in those various studies. And we put them on a normalized index. So on the very left-hand side here, these are relatively small disturbances, small pressures on ecosystems. And on the right-hand side, they're absolutely enormous pressures on ecosystems. And the only thing I want to draw your attention to here is, so this is the relative log response ratio of ecosystem responses, and this is the absolute. Really just look here, and even at very, very weak pressures, you can have absolutely disproportionately strong impacts on ecosystems and their biodiversity. So small disturbances can have dramatic effects, and we don't really know why. So we have massive variability in ecosystem responses. And that, I guess, all relates to any of you that know ecologists will know the answer to almost any question you ask an ecologist comes out from this, what I'm going to call the unofficial universal law in ecology, which is it depends. And really what that means is that ecosystems are hugely context dependent and reliant on their dynamics are reliant on an awful lot of stochastic responses. That really, they're very subject to local scale, if you like, stochasticities. And it means it's very challenging for us to develop general rules and general understanding about how ecosystems and biodiversity will respond to climate change and other kinds of human pressures. But that probably strikes the fear into the hearts of engineers. It certainly does to ecologists. But of course, it's very important to say, do not panic, all is not lost. We just need to recognize that at these small scales, things are very, very challenging to predict. But there are solutions. And those solutions really arise out of the fact that we need long-term ecological data collected at the local site scale. We can gain information and gain general understanding from larger regional and global scale assessments using things like remote sensing at time series. But actually, to really understand what's happening in ecosystems, we need to understand their ecological context. We need to understand the biodiversity that they contain and the dynamics of that biodiversity. You'll note everything I've talked about so far, that the technologies for measuring ecosystems and ecological integrity at larger scales, they're really all based on habitat structure and measures of vegetation that we can sense using satellites. But they can tell us absolutely nothing directly about in particular, the animals that live at the local site scale. So things like birds, bees, bats, other insects, things that live under the ground. We really have no idea how to monitor those. We certainly can't yet properly, and certainly not directly using these larger scale remote sensing techniques. So we need small scale, local site scale ways of measuring biodiversity. The challenge, and which is why we have very poor understanding, generally speaking, at these local scales, is because right now, the techniques for doing this are expensive. They require experts. They require people to go out and take samples, process those samples. They require a lot of expertise, taxonomic expertise for people to go out and identify things. Because of that, these measurements tend to be done at small spatial and temporal scales, driven by project funding, and also done in a very haphazard and really unstandardized way. Different experts have different interests and do things in different ways when they make assessments. And also, because all of that is very expensive, the long-term ecological research sites that we have around the world, those that are in existence and taking continuous measurements for many decades, are actually disappearing. The funding is being taken from them gradually over time. And we're seeing that happening all around the world because they're expensive to maintain. The solution to this, of course, has to be technology. What we need, and what are certainly emerging, is a set of complementary sensors for passive monitoring of biodiversity and the environment that couple novel sensors for detecting different elements of biodiversity, like birds, bats, bees, insects, worms, all of these kinds of things that live under the soil as well, and couple those sensors with artificial intelligence-based species detection and identification tools. So without a doubt, that is the future that will create a step change in our understanding of biodiversity and our ability to protect it. What we also need, though, is not just the development of these sensors, but we need to use them properly. We need to think through how to integrate the data that they all produce in a very harmonized, standardized way around the planet. Because if we do that, then we can really leverage the power produced by these sensors and the data produced by these sensors to really integrate small-scale information, integrated with much larger scale information from things like satellites. And the real power of all of that data really increases exponentially over time, as we've seen from the satellite information in storms and mangroves. So you'll all have seen various different types of technologies, I'm sure, that we use for passively monitoring the natural world. I think the most established at this stage is the remarkable tools that we have now for using with passive acoustic monitoring of ecosystems. I think still the largest acoustic monitoring network in the world is the Okion network on the island of Okinawa in Japan, which has been operating now since, I think, 2016 continuously. There's 24 sites around that island that have been recording sound continuously since 2016. And then the sound that's produced by these sensors can be then processed and fed through machine learning tools to identify various different species using this information. So basically anything, I say here, classifying birds and bats using machine learning because they're the most common tools, but actually we can identify lots of different sounds. Anything that makes any part of biodiversity that makes sound, of course, can in principle be detected and identified using these technologies. So we're at the point now where there's companies doing this, and we have large-scale monitoring networks almost or about to be established for identifying species using the sounds that they make. Almost all of this information comes from the really amazing BirdNet data set, which is managed and produced out of Cornell in the United States. And in that, I think they have many, many different observations. It's a huge identify it, or at least it'll give you a close approximation of what bird it thinks it is. But of course, it's developed based on birds from around the world, and it needs to be tested locally and harmonized locally. And something that you might be interested in, but causes a bit of an issue when it comes to identifying birds, is that birds are like people in that they have local dialects. So a North American bird might not sing in exactly the same way. It has a different accent than the same species of bird from where I live in Ireland. So they may need to be attuned. Certainly lots of different species will need to be tuned into local dialects and local conditions. Another major issue that we have had, we've been using this tool for the last year in Ireland. Again, Anthony Gibbons for his PhD. One issue that we found was that we're not identifying species, rare species very well, because of course there are not many examples of them in the BirdNet data set or in our own data sets, simply by virtue of the fact that they're rare. So we don't have many examples, and the models we've trained for identifying those rare species are not very good. So what Anthony's done is he developed a generative AI-based data augmentation technique for actually improving recognition of many of these rare species. And what he showed very clearly, actually, for species that are rare, generative AI can produce, certain models of generative AI can produce really enhanced detection and prediction skills for these rare species by just producing synthetic bird sounds of these rare species. It can actually, in every case we looked at, it enhanced detectability and the power of models to detect these rare species. So apart from sound, another method really that is becoming really, really well established around the world is iNaturalist, and really using AI-based species recognition from images. And also, obviously, you can automate things, this technology for things like camera traps as well. So now the real power of that's the same as BirdNet really is that now in iNaturalist, citizens take pictures and upload them and identify things. They have a really, really clever way of identifying which people are really good at identifying species, which ones aren't so good, and so on. But now there's more than 300 million observations, images in the iNaturalist data set, identifying more than 550,000 species, more than 10 million users and contributors from around the world. So this has really grown to be an extraordinarily powerful data set that is increasing in utility and power all of the time. So apart from sound and images, of course, there's many new novel sensor technologies that are also emerging that are there to sense biodiversity at the fields or site scale. One of the most, something that I'm particularly excited about is the use of millimeter wave antennae and microdoppler signals for detecting and identifying flying insects. This is something we've been working a lot on in my group here. I collaborate with a lot of engineers, people like Nicola Marchetti and Adam Narbudovic here, and this is part of the PhD work of Linta Antony. And Linta has developed a really nice way of getting spectrograms from the microdoppler signals from insects flying past antenna. And you can see here, this is just signatures from 5 different species of wasps and bees. So really important pollinators in Ireland. And they have very, very distinct signatures, which Linta has used machine learning classification to identify these different species. And actually, they're really, really very, very different. So the accuracy of these models is about 85% at the moment. So they're really good, not only at distinguishing between obviously different species like wasps and bees, but actually can even distinguish very reliably between bees of the same genus, of the Bombus genus. So this technology then offers huge potential for passively identifying and quantifying bees that fly close to things like flower beds and so on, where you might want to put one of these antennae. So we're testing these technologies now in the field. We've attached cameras and lots of other sensors to our antennae. We're using, at the moment, doing a lot of work looking at bees coming in and out of beehives, and looking at where they're going and relating their signals to the distance that they are, for example, from the antennae, the velocity that they're flying at, and other behaviors as well, to really enhance our ability to link the location of a bee, its behavior, with its signal on the spectrogram. And we're now at the point where actually we want to roll out this technology to really scale up and grow our data sets, so we can really develop models for artificial intelligence-based identification of flying insects from around the world. So that's something we're really concentrating on now, is to start the process of developing a very large data set that people can add to from around the world, so that we can try and develop these machine learning based models for identifying insects from around the world. So in terms of next steps, I think the most obvious ones are that to really leverage the individual and most importantly, I think, combined power of these different sensor modalities and technologies to understand biodiversity change across scales, we need to develop over the next few years networks of complementary multimodal sensor arrays. So sensor arrays for sensing different aspects of biodiversity that might include cameras, might include sound and microphones, but also include things like millimeter wave antennae and so on, to sense not only biodiversity, but environmental conditions as well, for example. I think almost equally as importantly, we need to develop methods for standardizing and harmonizing data collection and data collection protocols from all of these different systems. We need to do that from the very, very beginning to really enhance and streamline data pipelines, and so that really we can then scale up the data that are coming from these things, primarily so that we can integrate them, or one of the main reasons, so that we can integrate them with data from much larger scales, such as satellites, remote sensing from drones, and data from drones, climate data, and so on. So really, we're at the point where we know we have sensors that work. We really need to combine them, leverage their complementarity, understand and enhance how we can bring all those data that they produce together to harmonize them, and to really then leverage the power of all of this extra sensing capability over time. And I think the benefits of this are clear, and it will really help us enhance biodiversity. It will give us a much more deep mechanistic understanding of the impacts humanity are having on biodiversity across scales, from small scales all the way up to the global scale. And with that deep mechanistic understanding, of course, it gives us the power to manage and protect biodiversity around the world. And really, that means also protect and enhance the resilience of society to withstand the devastating impacts of climate change that we're starting to see. It basically gives us actionable biodiversity data at scale. So that's the obvious benefit, in that we have much better information to manage the natural world. But actually, a sort of less obvious benefit of this is really at the local scale. And that's what you see here on your right-hand side. You're giving power by giving information to local communities, local landowners on biodiversity and actions that they may be doing on their own piece of land, like producing their own nature-based solutions on land, improving management of ecosystems at the local scale, putting in hedgerows, putting their own solutions, nature-based solutions to for example, clean water and so on. And it allows people at that local scale and local communities to quantify the benefits of what they've done. And I think that's an enormous demonstration of the positive effects of local biodiversity management. And it gives a very much a positive story, and a bottom-up positive story to people that own land, and to industry and government and so on. So it's not just about protecting at the global scale, but actually biodiversity protection really comes from bottom up, and understanding and quantifying the benefits of proper protection and management of land. So I guess my key take-home message, I started all negatively. We face huge problems at the global scale, but my message is there is hope. But what we need to do is collaborate to get there. We need to have a real vision for how we can understand and protect biodiversity using technology, and we need to collaborate to help get us there. I'm going to leave you with a quote from an alumnus of my university, Samuel Beckett, who said, "In the landscape of extinction, precision is next to godliness." Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Yes, Ian, thank you so much for really a very enlightening and compelling presentation, really. We have a few questions that came in so far. So everyone, if you have questions, please type them in the chat. We're going to spend a few minutes now addressing your questions. To start us off, I would like to ask you to put things in perspective a little bit more with respect to the topic of the human memory of what healthy ecosystems used to look like. We know that that memory is rapidly fading. So I'm wondering if we have ways to capture that memory in the field of ecology and environmental science, if there are people who are working on that, not only in order to help us motivate our communities, our politicians, everyone to work and invest on the problem of restoring ecosystems, but also in some cases to use that understanding, that human understanding of ecosystems to help us complement the work that you do. For instance, if you go to the Arctic and talk to elders in those villages, they can tell you where the fertile hunting grounds used to be. They can tell you how the environment is changing. So is that a component of your field of research?
Thank you very much. Great question. I mean, it's not a direct component, but of course, understanding how biodiversity has changed over time is a very compelling thing, and communicating that is extraordinarily compelling to people. Again, tying it to their local experience. And there are many, many examples. I gave you my own personal example from Masai Mara, Serengeti, which I always communicate to students about how much that part of the world has changed in the last 20, 30 years. And these things, of course, can be immensely personal. And over the last few decades that I've been working in various ecosystems around the world, all I've seen is damage and more damage. And that's the truth, which has its own, I think it's fair to say there have been quite a few publications on the mental health of people who work on biodiversity science, because it's not a good news story, right? You're looking in your own lifetime and all you see is destruction everywhere, and that's the truth of it. But of course, local impacts on biodiversity are what are the hook that get into local people's minds and local communities. And I think there's, in terms of educating people about the scale of the biodiversity crisis, it's probably the best hook that we have. An example I have frequently used is when I used to drive around to my grandparents' house, which is an hour through the peat bogs in the centre of Ireland. Um, I remember we used to have to stop halfway to clean the insects off the car window, and that hasn't happened since I've been an adult. Because, of course, of pesticides and lots of other things going on. And this pattern, of course, of change hasn't been uniform around the world, but that is my experience, is that kids don't see that anymore. They don't see, certainly not on the drives that I used to do when I was a child and clean the windows, because I hated doing it because my dad made me do it. I don't think kids have that experience anymore, certainly where I'm from. And that's something that I say to people. And that's my own story. So there is certainly an enormous element of communication of the scale of the problem. And I think when I say scale of the problem, it's not only a massive problem and massive change we've seen, but it's happened in such a short time frame. I think that is what's so worrying. The flip side of that is that we have got this moving baseline syndrome where kids now don't have that connection to biodiversity that maybe even I had when I was younger, 30 or 40 years ago. And then you worry about their children and their children and so on, that they don't have that connection of, if you like, with the wonder of the natural world and the sort of things that we used to see that we just don't see anymore. So there is that worry as well, that the moving baseline means that uh, um, it sort of erodes the power of that communication tool, I think, and that part of memory. I don't know if that
Indeed.
answers your question, but it's certainly something to think about, Carol, in that our own lifetimes and the lifetimes of really, it's your own lifetime experience and how you communicate things to your children. I think that has real power. I think that power of that story sort of erodes when you go on to grandparents and great grandparents and great,
Yeah,
because we have less connection to their memories. We have less connections to them. Um,
exactly. Yeah, indeed. That's exactly the observation. So thank you for adding on your comments to that. So let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into some of the specifics of the technologies that you described. Someone asked if there is a low-hanging fruit in your mind on what types of sensor technologies really needs to be prioritized, to be developed more to help you the most, because we're all engineers, we like to know this.
Great question. I think so. The pragmatist in me says we should use technologies that we know are cheap and where we already have really good AI based identifying tools. And that would be acoustics, because it's cheap technology. You can have different microphones in the same unit that listen to birds, but also listen to higher frequency things like bats. We can use them to infer behavior with some because, for example, bats, when they're just flying, they're emitting at a certain frequency, but when they're feeding, they really upregulate that frequency because they're moving much more quickly. So you can actually detect that change very easily. So you can infer behaviors, for example, from changing signals and so on. So the pragmatist says acoustics are really something that we could roll out, and if we standardized how we collect this information and bring it all together, standardize the sort of recording frequencies, how we collate the information, how we bring it all together into, if you like, centralized databases and so on. There's To me, that would already create a huge step forward. But there are many other technologies out there that really complement things that make noise. And the challenge with acoustic recorders, of course, is that it only detects things that make noise. And actually, in noisy environments, which is, we've done a lot of work, for example, in deploying these things on wind farms, where it's noisy, there's a lot of background noise. You need to create those extra steps to filter out a lot of that background noise. Another example would be from, for example, Okinawa, where they have this really large network of acoustic recorders. You've got a lot of cicada background noise, and how do you filter that out in the summer, for example? But it creates a real sort of practical difficulties. Another issue around wind farms, as a good example, is we know that there's major collision risk, particularly of large raptors, large predatory birds. Um, Large raptors don't make any noise. You won't know if they're there or not from these acoustic
Mm.
recorders. So we need to have complementary ways of identifying them and quantifying them. So
Right.
acoustics do a lot, but they're really we're missing out on a huge other important dimensions of biodiversity by just focusing on this one sensor type, and that's why I think we do need a visual element to biodiversity quantification, but also. The problem with cameras, of course, is that they really only see big things. They won't see small things, and so that's where I think the complementarity from the radar could be really really useful. And all I've done so far is talk about things above land, but there are other methodologies that we can use for measuring sound, for example, underwater, and vibrations under the soil, and ways of identifying different species from those vibrations. And so there are many different things I think that we need to do, but a lot of these sensors, as you can imagine, are all at different scales or different points in their development. But I think we really need to think about if we're going to use technology to monitor the natural world, we need to understand the bias that creates. What we're hearing things, so we put them down as important and we're measuring them, but we need to recognize what we're not actually detecting as well through these different modalities, and to try and cover that space if we can.
Right, right. And to your point, silence is as much a data point, or the absence of noise is as much a data point as the noise itself. A silent forest is a problem,
Mhm.
the lack of bird populations and yeah. So I wonder if AI tools could help complement and analyze, the lack of data as a data point as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think I think the real power, a bit like we saw with the satellite data over time, is the real power of these data come with time.
Mhm.
And there are emerging statistical tools that we're developing for which we can only do when we start to have data. We can create data using simulations, but actually to create realistic ecosystem dynamics, we need to have long-term multi-species data sets, and that then we can use to develop tools for example, identifying measures of trends of change, of early warning systems, of disturbance, and so on. But we,
Right. In fact, I've been an active citizen naturalist on iNaturalist, which you mentioned, and I've been wondering because I still see comments coming in from observations I made years ago. So that's really interesting. But I'm wondering if iNaturalist or these kinds of tools will detect changes over time and say, not only we have cumulative observations, but how did these observations change over time?
again, I think this is where the power of data come in, and that can only take place once we start to have the data come in and being collated and harmonized in the same location. So actually, we had Pablo Peroni here last week, giving us a presentation from Caltech about iNaturalist and the way that they collate the information, and from dealing with information from citizens. And it was really interesting about how people can take a picture and they can say, this is what I identify it as. And it actually goes into a really smart, as in clever, set of models for saying, well, actually, this person typically isn't very good at identifying this kind of species. They're reasonable. And then it attaches a probability and a weighting to that for when it's used to identify, and used in the machine learning tools for actual species identification. So there's all this background stuff that goes on when you start to have a system of the scale of iNaturalist, which is really remarkable. But that has only come about because of its utility and because people started using it and saw the benefits of it. And I think
Mhm.
the to be able to get there, we need to be able to develop somehow a similar utility for different kinds of sensors.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Really, really encouraging. All right, so let's switch to another topic. Someone is asking if you have work, if you're doing work with other associations and countries around the world, and what you're learning from working with people around the world.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I guess my answer to that is absolutely. My experience is pretty much international, as in I did my PhD in Zambia and Tanzania on the second biggest, second oldest lake in the world, which is Lake Tanganyika. And for the last, I guess, 30 years, have been closely involved with universities and partnerships and things like that particularly in Eastern and Central Africa and Kenya, looking at measuring and monitoring biodiversity. And then I've been doing that for a long time, but also in Ireland, obviously there's a lot of involvement with local institutions and government. And I used to also sit on the scientific committee for the European Environment Agency, which is a really interesting experience, actually. So in Europe, I mean, I did a lot of my postdoc work looking at harmonizing data sets for implementing the European Water Framework Directive. And a real issue for that was to try and harmonize data collection and biodiversity metrics, even though across Europe, from all countries across Europe, even though data were collected in different ways and so on. So in that sense, I'm very familiar with the issues of non-standardization of data collection. And I think that's why I think we have a massive opportunity now, because we haven't done it yet, of ensuring that we can really try and harmonize data collection and data pipeline protocols
Mm.
using these new technologies. I think it's a huge opportunity that potentially could be wasted. But if we do it right from the beginning, I think we'll be able the potential to leverage hugely important data and information and findings. It's actually enormous. Like, these technologies have such potential.
Right, right. You know, you're echoing a little bit some of the things we hear from oceanographers, for example, who work on removing carbon dioxide from the oceans. They tell us that harmonization of data collection is a huge problem to solve and to make the data more trustworthy as well, which I don't know if this is something that your community, bumps into as well, the problem of trust of the data that you're collecting.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a major issue. And I think I alluded to it a bit earlier on when I talked about long-term ecological research being done at small spatial and temporal scales. And really, our data collection exercises, because they're laborious and expensive, tend to be done along the scales of funding, which is 3 to 5 years. And then you'll have good data for 3 to 5 years and it's gone. And then
Mm.
if somebody comes back a few years later with another funded project, they might have different methods. They'll have different expertise and identify different species, or maybe from different groups, because they're asking different questions. And that's a fundamental problem that we get throughout the world. And actually, it's why I would say that our understanding of biodiversity dynamics is remarkably poor, because real dynamics that matter in terms of affecting large scale things, everything occurs at the local scale. Ecological interactions occur at the local scale, and we really only have snapshots at small scales in space and time in terms of ecological dynamics. And that's why I get so excited when I talk about the potential of technology. In terms of trustworthiness, I mentioned bias already. I mean, no technology is perfect. People aren't perfect, right? Currently, we rely on, for example, traditionally, our traditional monitoring techniques would be a bird expert will go out and listen for a few hours in the same spot for a few days in a row and write down all the calls that they hear and collate them. And that's the data set. But of course, people lose attention, lose focus. Maybe if they're out there for a few hours, it might be windy, they might sneeze, they miss things. Humans have an error associated with them, even experts. And that's something that we tend not to think about. Technology is exactly the same. They have different issues, but of course, their ability to detect things has some error, and is based on probabilities. Um, But I think what's really important is that we recognize that and understand. And actually, the beauty of technology is we can quantify the uncertainties and the errors associated with them. And I think with a recognition of that, that then we can try our best to reduce that bias insofar as we possibly can. But
Right, right.
recognizing that every sensor has inherently a bias to it.
Right. So, Ian, we are at the top of the hour, but since we have the luxury of having you as our last speaker, I'm going to break the rule and I'm going to ask you one more question before we let you go, because I think this last one is important. Someone is asking if you have an example of local initiatives that could lead to broader changes at the governmental level.
Oh, that's another really good question. All I can give you is an example that is close to my heart at this time, something that actually is a project that we've been working quite a lot on over the last few years, and it's with the Irish and European wind energy industry. I mentioned in my talk as onshore wind is one of these potential win-win solutions that addresses both climate change, carbon removal, decarbonization of our economies, enhances food security, and also, if done properly, enhance biodiversity protection and conservation. And what we're doing now is that in Ireland, we're actually deploying a lot of our sensors onto wind farms so that, just like I showed in my second to last slide, wind farm owners can actually communicate to local communities how many birds and bees and all of these other components of biodiversity are actually living on their wind farm. And they can also communicate if they have any biodiversity enhancement plans or projects. They can actually quantify the extra biodiversity or the added benefits that those initiatives have brought. And actually communicating those numbers to people has had a massive effect because like all landowning industries, I guess, the wind energy industry has, in some ways, in Ireland, suffered from poor reputation in that it damages. You know, if you talk to a lot of the public about it, especially the rural public, they don't like wind farms because they don't look nice, right? Now, one argument is, well, look what they're replacing. The wind turbines are a darn sight nicer than the old factories, coal burning and peat burning factories that we used to have. But even aside from that, um, I think what we've done through this project is we've now developed a sectoral biodiversity action plan, local scale, site specific biodiversity action plans for all these wind farms. Is actually the main benefit of it, actually, we've been told is the narrative around local wind farms has shifted in local communities about how we're seeing emerge a much more positive sentiment towards these wind farms because they're quantifying biodiversity, because they're showing how positive management can actually enhance biodiversity for at the local scale for communities. Especially things that are, every different community has a different hook that really gets them. Like, for example, we're finding different bat species being found in wind farms that were never there before. At least we didn't know were there before. Populations of important birds that have, for some reason, are locally important, are sentimental to local communities. These sort of things, different wind farms communicate and emphasize different things, but the key point is the technology we're using to find these organisms is actually giving numbers to the landowners who then communicate that to local people. And it really is, I don't want to exaggerate and said it's caused a groundswell of positivity, but it certainly has changed the narrative. Absolutely has changed the narrative. Local communities are seeing that these big infrastructures actually have benefits to them and to their community, whereas before they were pretty much against them.
Right, right. All right. Well, I think we need to close this really important presentation here. What a way to end our forum. I'm going to turn it back to Charlie to close the forum. And Ian, I want to thank you again very much. Very enjoyable to meet you and listen to you um, and opening your minds as you did. Um, everyone who is still online, please stick around for a couple more minutes and have Charlie tell us about his plans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. We're starting to form a program committee, technical program committee for next year, a steering committee. And one of our goals for next year will be to increase registration. Another goal will be to um, uh, support the TSCMO, Technology for a Stable, Sustainable Climate. We'll be transitioning that way. We're always looking for good talks, so whenever somebody comes across a good talk, drop us a note. And the other aspect is we'll continue to put talks up on the web. Currently, most of them are already posted. If you go to the program and scroll past the meeting at a glance, you'll start seeing the links to the talks. So with that, I want to thank everyone who helped bring this about. Want to thank Vicky Osborne in particular for fighting to sign up um, patrons despite all the problems that we had moving along. And I want to thank Feng Yuan, Mitra Deep, and Dialon. And especially I want to thank the co-chair, Ravinder Dahia. And with that, I'll close the conference. Thank you.